Welcome back to On the Move with Victor Shi. Today is Tuesday, January 3rd. It is no surprise, as you've probably all heard me talk about, Gen Zers are the most digitally connected generation in America. We're a generation that grew up with social media to the point that it's ingrained in our identities. I think the latest figure that I read said that more than 95% of Gen Zers have at least one social media platform. It has completely changed the way that we receive and consume information, and as many benefits as there may be to that, including the fact that Gen Zers have really, I think, leveraged social media as a way to launch massive movements, to spread awareness about important issues, there are also many dangers, including the threat of disinformation and misinformation. And against this backdrop, I think it's so important for all of us to know not only how to detect misinformation and disinformation, but also how to respond to them effectively. And today, I'm excited to welcome on the show Asha Rangappa, someone you've probably seen on Twitter for her, I think, epic clapbacks, just her logical breakdowns of the news of the day, or on TV, or from her new Substack called The Freedom Academy with Asha Rangappa. Asha's resume is too long for me to list completely, but in a nutshell, she was a former FBI agent, former associate dean at Yale Law School, and is now a senior lecturer at Yale's Jackson School of Global Affairs, where she teaches classes on information warfare on social media. Thank you so much for being with me today, Asha. I'm so excited for this conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Victor. I'm
Of
I'm happy to be here.
Of course. So one of the biggest challenges I think we have right now against the backdrop of social media and so much information is disinformation, misinformation. I want to get your take on that, especially as it relates to Harry and Meghan later. But before then, I want to ask you what you think young people and maybe the general public should know about the current information ecosystem and how that's different from, say, 10 or 20 years ago.
Yes. So, disinformation has been around for a long time, whether it's been perpetuated by foreign actors or domestic actors. But the internet and social media has really changed the game. And social media platforms in particular create the perfect storm for disinformation because their revenue model is designed to prioritize things like engagement and virality. And these intersect with cognitive processes for consumers, which makes them more responsive to things that create anger and outrage and a lot of emotional reactivity. Often that includes narratives that contain disinformation. And so what you have is that false narratives travel very quickly and very far on these platforms, often before the truth has time to catch up to it. And unfortunately, our cognitive processes are such that um, that disinformation has a first mover advantage. In other words, once people see false information and they internalize it, it's very hard to undo that after the fact. And so, what we need to do is try to understand this ecosystem. So I'm glad you're having this conversation, so that we can be more resilient to it, because all of us are going to uh, get hit with disinformation, if we're on social media.
Absolutely. And as I hear you say this, I can't help but think about the importance of teaching news and information literacy to people in classrooms. And I know Illinois is one of the states where I'm currently at, where they passed a new bill that requires, I think, middle schools to teach news literacy. But short of that happening in all middle schools and high schools around the country, how do you think just the we as people on social media can better spot and recognize misinformation and disinformation?
Yes, I think, I mean, there's so many different things, but the first is to really understand the sources from which you're consuming information. What social media and the internet does is it sort of flattens a lot of the traditional gatekeepers that have been there, that separate fact from fiction. When we had analog media, for example, you knew when you picked up the New York Times that they have certain journalistic standards, and you knew that down at the bottom the National Enquirer is there, and they don't really. And you're able to kind of visually see this distinction. On these rolling feeds, though, everything is coming at you, and it's almost equal. They all have
Yeah.
equal footing, right? And so I would first start probably with a number of resources that provide reliability ratings, or there's something called the media Ad Fontes media bias chart, which I use in my
Mhm.
class, which will give you both reliability and bias indices for your um, sources of information, and to basically educate yourself on, what are the standards and practices of the outlets from which you typically get your information. And if you're getting your information, or if you see something from an outlet that you're not familiar with, to check it out before you retweet and further push it out into the ecosystem, the information ecosystem.
Definitely useful. And I want to turn to a piece that you wrote for your new Substack about the Harry and Meghan documentary. I watched that documentary, and one of the things I noticed but couldn't quite contextualize was, I guess, why and how effectively they were able to claim their narrative and then push back against the British tabloids. But you wrote about how their series on Netflix was a masterclass on how to respond to this information ecosystem and how to launch a counterattack on false narratives. And one of the terms that you used was information warfare. Help us understand what you mean by information warfare.
When I talk about information warfare, I mean that there's a battle for hearts and minds. We think of kinetic battlefields, hard power, but there
Yeah.
is an entire space that now is a very important space, given the digital space right now, where people's ideas about the world and things and their behavior in the real world is shaped by their perceptions. And so um, we have to engage in that space, and particularly, as I just mentioned, with the traditional barriers to the traditional gatekeepers to media kind of coming down. This information battlefield is saturated by actors who are literally there to try to shape people's perceptions and opinions. We've seen this with Russia doing this, both in our 2016 election, 2020
Yeah.
election, but other actors, tabloids in this case, are doing that as well. And so the question is, how do you compensate for that asymmetry that these big institutional actors, whether it's the a right wing media ecosystem, whether it's a foreign actor, have a lot of power, and they're pushing narratives using a lot of different forces. And it's very difficult for individual actors to compete in that space. And what I think Meghan and Harry did very effectively was leverage a lot of resources to kind of bring their story at least into a place where it can compete on
Mhm.
some equal footing with the narratives that they're trying to push back against.
So I was particularly fascinated by point number two, which is for us to get into the battle. And it's something that I often wonder, which is, I mean, whether or not you engage with those who spread misinformation, disinformation, and possibly give them a platform, or amplify their message, or do you ignore it? So I'm wondering, why do you suggest that we get into the battle? And do you think not enough people are doing that right now?
I don't think enough people are doing that right now. We kind of think, our work is going to speak for itself. And I quote
Yeah.
Michelle Obama, who's like,
Yeah.
when they go low, we go high. That doesn't work. We have to get in there and have an affirmative story to tell. And I think one area where we did this really effectively at the state level is when the Biden administration pre-bunked false narratives that were going to be pushed by Russia to justify their invasion of Ukraine. They got
Mm.
into the battle. They understood that what Russia was going to do was put out fabricated stories, of genocide, of biolabs, or whatever it is, to try to justify their invasion. And the Biden administration declassified information and put it out there in advance, which basically made it much more difficult for these narratives to take hold because they had the first mover advantage
Right.
then.
Right.
Um, we do this. I think we did that effectively because it was like a military foreign policy thing at stake. I think we don't do that well enough at a more domestic level. And I think it's for that reason that things like the big lie,
Yeah.
vaccine, COVID disinformation, all of these are allowed to run rampant, and we haven't yet saturated that space with the truth.
So it seems like there are still so many people who believe in that big lie and misinformation when it comes to COVID. Even if we, I think, I don't know. I'm wondering what you think on this. Even if we get into the information ecosystem and get in that battlefield, do you think it'll reach the audience that believes in the big lie or believes in, that the COVID vaccine changes your DNA or has magnets in them? I mean, do you think there's any way for us to reach them in this space anymore?
Well, in that piece that you referenced about Harry and Meghan,
Yeah.
I cite a Columbia law professor, Yochai Benkler, who
Mhm.
has a model, and it's called the propaganda feedback loop. And basically, this is from a book he co-authored called Network Propaganda, where they're looking at this sort of closed right-wing media ecosystem, where these, kind of centered with Fox News, Breitbart, there's a siloed audience that is almost impervious to outside influences. But what he says is that's about maybe 25 to 30% of the American population, which is still
Mhm.
really sad, but that there is still a fair amount who only have one foot in that door and also have one foot in kind of the rest of they're getting their information from other sources. And so they are the ones to target, right? There are
Mhm.
enough undecided or kind of people who are still open or trying to understand what's true and what's not. Those are the people we can reach. We may not be able to reach the people that have completely gone down the rabbit hole, but
Mhm.
I do think that there are some that can be brought out, and I think those are the people that we need to be focused on.
Absolutely, and that actually gives me a lot of comfort, and I remember hearing someone say that those who watch Tucker Carlson, even though he's the most watched, I guess, prime time or nighttime, news show, they represent a very, very small slice of the electorate, but they're the loudest voices, so it seems like there are more of this than there are of, them, but in reality, that's not the case. I wanna talk about your last point because as a young person who's on Twitter and Instagram, although not on TikTok, I find it fascinating because you point out that we should be leveraging platforms like TikTok and Instagram to spread the message and be in this I guess battlefield. I'm wondering what advice you have for young people who are on social media and how they can use their platforms to respond to lies and misinformation.
Well, Victor, I think you're a model for that. I mean, you're
Oh,
doing exactly that. You're very politically engaged, and you're putting out your message to a younger audience using these different platforms. Um, I think that what we need to find a way is to translate. I use in that example the January 6th committee report,
mhm.
which is so full of really important information for people to be civically responsible Americans, right? To understand. How do you get from that 845-page report to something that students in college are going to like know what's in there? And we need to recognize that we are in uh, a, an age where people need things in digestible chunks,
Mhm.
often in some sort of visual format. And we need to have mechanisms to be able to produce that. We need to understand that the other side has a very highly coordinated, well oiled, basically propaganda machine that's pushing out information in that way on all of these platforms with lies. And so we have to create something that will compete with it in all of these different spaces. I'm not sure what the answer is, but I just know that it has to be done.
Yes, for sure. And in that same vein as January 6th, before I let you go, I want to ask you about that because you've been so helpful in helping us understand the complexities of who was involved in January 6th. And I wish we had that diagram that you drew on Twitter that shows all of the different actors and what their role was. With the new Congress being sworn in today, the January 6th committee is basically their work is over, and that puts the burden on DOJ's shoulder. I'm wondering what you expect from DOJ in the coming months based off of what we've seen so far.
Well, I think that it will really depend on what evidence DOJ is able to gather that they believe will both A, be admissible in court and convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. And I think for that reason, we need to really, really be thankful that we had the January 6th committee. We get
Mhm.
so focused on the criminal process, and we forget that that is just the tip of the iceberg. What can make it over some very, very high barriers. If we had relied only on DOJ, we would only be seeing just small snippets. It's almost like looking at a movie and seeing just a few scenes of it.
Mhm.
And what the January 6th committee has done is give us the entire movie,
Right.
whether or not it results in criminal indictment. So I'm not really sure. I don't want to speculate because I don't know what they have and what they're able to put together. I know that there are things that we intuitively understand are crimes and believe should be punished, but we also need to recognize that we have um, our criminal justice system does have a lot of high bars to
Mhm.
clear before the Department of Justice will go down that road. But I do think that there will be accountability, including accountability for Donald Trump,
Yeah.
in one way or another.
Hopefully 2023 is the year that we finally see that happen. Um, Lastly, tell us about your new Substack because I've been following it. I know many people have been following it. It's such an interesting way to design a Substack. So tell us a little bit about it and where we can find it.
Yes, my Substack is called the Freedom Academy, which I named after an initiative in the 1960s that was intended to create basically a citizens' academy to inform people and educate them about propaganda and disinformation and create a more resilient American society that was united around democratic values. It ended up not going anywhere, but it's a fascinating story and I have it on my about page. And so I thought that I would use the Substack to basically create a form of that. And so you can be a free subscriber and I write pieces like this Meghan and Harry article, which offers, a different insight into the news of the day. But I also offer a paid subscription, which includes an ongoing course on disinformation and understanding the tactics and goals and how it works. So I encourage people to check it out. It's at asharangappa.substack.com.
It truly is like being in class with Professor Rangappa. It's amazing. Um, Asha, thank you so much for joining us. This was so fascinating. And hopefully we will see much more of you on TV and on the Substack. Thank you.
Thanks, Victor.
Of course. Well, today is the day the new Congress gets sworn into session. I think the votes are going to start at noon to determine who the next Speaker of the House will be, and it comes as no surprise that Kevin McCarthy still lacks the votes needed to be Speaker of the House. And he actually admitted that right before we went on the show today. He spoke to a number of Republicans. In the House, and basically said that he didn't have the 5 votes necessary to be the Speaker of the House, at least for the first round. And that'll be the first time that that happens in 100 years. And so I think it'll be really interesting to see what happens with this. My prediction is that I think the first round, it'll show that Kevin McCarthy doesn't have the votes needed. But then I think Republicans will cave in. They'll give him the votes necessary on the second, third, fourth, who knows how many rounds it'll take. But eventually, I think he will get the votes, which I think is sad because I think it shows the performative aspect of this, but we'll see what happens. I think it's going to be a very messy show, at least for the next few hours and maybe even next couple of days. So all eyes will be on that to see just how chaotic the Republican Party is right now. In better news, I mentioned this yesterday, but Maxwell Frost, the first Gen Z member of Congress, will be sworn in today, along with many, many other great Democratic candidates who won office. Top of mind includes Mary Peltola from Alaska, who will, I think, be the first Democrat to win any office since, I think, in at least 30 years. And so that's great news. You have Reverend Raphael Warnock in Georgia getting reelected, and also John Fetterman getting elected from Pennsylvania. So I think we have a bunch of great candidates getting sworn in today, and I think they will be a great example of how senators and representatives should govern and be a great contrast to that of Republicans and how they're deciding things and governing things. So that should give us all hope. The last thing I want to address, and I saw this yesterday, is a recent piece in the Wall Street Journal by Jonathan Haidt. I've read his stuff before. I think he has great content. But some of what he offered in his piece yesterday basically said that Gen Z is getting weakened because of social media. I think to some extent that's true. And based off of our conversation with Asha today, I think it's why it's so important. We need to teach news literacy and equip Gen Zers in my generation with the tools needed to combat that. But it also, I think, has tremendous benefits. Social media has tremendous benefits. We've used it to do tremendous things, including launch massive movements to, I think, really kind of push the narrative on a lot of key issues. And he also, Jonathan, in that piece cited that a lot of our anxiety and the high levels of depression that Gen Zers face is because of social media. But I just don't think that's the case. You have this generation that's I think, has so many things coming at us, whether it's the high cost of education, whether it's gun violence, whether it's climate change. I think those are the things that really are coming after our generation. I think what contributes to a lot of the anxiety and worry that a lot of us feel. And so I think, yes, social media is a problem. I think a lot of the things that he said do make sense, but you can't help but ignore but that Gen Z and the way that we live and what kind of shapes our life is different from other generations. And I don't think you can blame that squarely on social media. I think it's on social media companies to do their part to really reform how these algorithms work. But at the same time, it's also about addressing the issues that really affect our generation. So hopefully this new Congress with Maxwell Frost will push that envelope. But I think it's an interesting piece. I'm curious what you all have to say about it and whether or not you think Gen Z is getting weakened because of social media, or whether it's because of other things, and social media might just be kind of the layer on top. So let me know what you think. It's in the Wall Street Journal. He is interviewed by a Wall Street Journal opinion columnist. I think it's an interesting, interview, no matter what you think about it. But I took issues with some of the things that he talked about, and curious to see what you all have to say about that. But that is all the news that I have for today. We will definitely keep on watching what happens with the Republican conference. But I think there's great news coming out of the Democratic conference. One last thank you to Nancy Pelosi for her tremendous leadership. She will be stepping down in just a little more than an hour and a half. Actually, sorry about that, 30 minutes. I'm on the Central Time, so it's 1 hour behind for me. So in just a little bit more than 30 minutes, Nancy Pelosi will no longer be Speaker of the House. She'll be passing the torch to Hakeem Jeffries, who I think is going to be a great leader. But truly, I think Nancy Pelosi has set the bar very, very high. At least before her, there has been no better speaker, in my opinion. So we all have a lot to be grateful for. And we will be back tomorrow for another episode of On the Move. We will be joined by Christopher Boozy, who I'm sure you have all seen on Twitter. He has a great new, I think that's in the works, a new social media platform that we should all be paying attention to. And so I'll be talking about that with him, as well as his role in the Harry and Meghan documentary, which I thought was really interesting, and how news spreads, or I guess bad news spreads so quickly. So be sure to tune in for that. It'll be at 8 a.m. Pacific time, 11 a.m. Eastern time. So don't miss that. And then on Thursday, I'll be answering your questions. And on Friday, I will be joined by David Rothkopf to talk about some of the international news of the day and some of the foreign policy things that young people and all of us should care about. So don't miss that. But again, we will be back tomorrow with a new episode of On the Move with Christopher Boozy at 8 a.m. Pacific time, 11 a.m. Eastern time, right here on youtube.com/Politicon. Be sure to like and subscribe and hit the bell for our daily notifications so you don't miss an episode of On the Move. Thank you so much. Stay safe, and I will see you tomorrow.